Last week, some of the wildest allegations that I have ever seen in D&D history have totally rocked the RPG community. One of the biggest content creators in Dungeons & Dragons has been accused of stealing another's work and presenting it as their own. But even worse, this alleged theft took place while the other creator was in a coma, unable to defend themselves, and they have since subsequently passed away. And now the alleged thief is being charged with grave robbing for profit on social media, and this has kicked up a total firestorm. So things aren't fun right now, and this is probably going to be one of those less jokey videos, so I'm gonna have to put away my Wikipedia page on Swedish Bellman jokes and instead open up the page on anti-humor. Hey, this stuff is funny though. Okay, so what has happened then? Well, frequent viewers of this channel will have heard of the Alexandrian, and that's not just because you're so sexy and smart. Seriously, YouTube has told me that subscribers to this channel are objectively better than non-subscribers. So, you know, if you want to be objectively better than everyone else, subscribe to the channel. But it's also because I've referenced it a lot in my videos. The Alexandrian is an incredibly famous blog run by the creator, Justin Alexander, who has written some of the greatest guides and most insightful works on how to run Dungeons & Dragons, dungeon crawls, and tabletop role-playing games generally. The Alexandrian is renowned for great GM advice, and for me, it has been truly formative to my GMing career. I love this blog. I think Justin has a great body of work, and it was no surprise to me when he came out with his new book, So You Want to Be a Games Master, in November of last year, and it has arrived with absolute rave reviews. Everyone I know who has reviewed it is a fan. However, what was a surprise to me is when I was told recently that Justin Alexander has stolen from one of the most famous designers in Dungeons & Dragons and RPGs, and that he has erased that designer's legacy and taken a phrase that was named after them and renamed it after himself for profit and to increase his own fame, all while the designer in question was in a coma and then recently passed away. And this accusation has been raised in an article that was posted last week called Xandering is Slandering. Now, that title is more than likely going to be gibberish to like 99% of people, but I promise that it will make sense to you in a second. Now, when I heard this accusation, I really did not want it to be true. I'm a huge fan of the Alexandrian, and so I immediately began investigating the claims for myself. And, okay, well, this is Janelle Jaquays. She sadly passed away on the 10th of January this year after a battle with Guillain-Barré syndrome. She was a fellow miniature collector, but also an artist and designer who was incredibly influential, both on tabletop and video games. She contributed to id Software and was part of creating games like Age of Empires, but she also worked on a lot of formative Dungeons & Dragons and role-playing game content, working with companies like TSR and Steve Jackson Games. She created the Dark Tower module, and also perhaps most famously the Caverns of Thracia module, a very beloved dungeon all the way back in 1979 that was so good that it was republished for D&D 3.5 edition in 2004. She is very famous, especially in the OSR community, and her work has a lot of fans. No doubt if you've enjoyed anything in tabletop, that work has been influenced by Janelle. She deserves to be up there with Arneson and Gygax as first generation D&D pioneers, and evidently Justin Alexander of the Alexandrian is a fan as well. So much of a fan, in fact, that in 2010 he created a blog post called Jacaying the Dungeon. This blog post focused on the work of Janelle Jaquays and why her dungeons were so good. So then, what the hell is Jacaying the Dungeon? Well, in the 1970s and 80s, the proverbial dungeon in Dungeons & Dragons tended to be incredibly linear. When you came to a dungeon, you would enter through the entrance. You would then follow the path and enter room 1. Fight monsters. Then continue down the path. Enter a trap, and then enter Room 2, fight monsters. Older dungeons like Keep on the Shadowfell were basically a railroad experience. A great example of what I mean that everyone watching this video will no doubt recognize is Matt Colville's very famous Delian Tomb. If you look at the design of this dungeon, players will always enter through the entrance. They will always encounter the offering room. They will always deal with the pressure plate and scythe trap, and they will always fight the bugbear boss. The only real surprising elements of this dungeon are how the party deal with the encounters within and whether they find the hidden room. Now, this makes for a great Gobbo's first dungeon, which is what the dungeon was designed to be, but it's pretty one note. You wouldn't want this to be every dungeon you ever encounter. Once you've been down there once, there's not a lot else to see, and if you're a DM, it wouldn't be as fun to run this dungeon over and over and over again. Being a forever DM in 1970 must have been pretty rough. No wonder everybody was throwing themselves off rooftops.
Going to join the Great Hall.
And so Janelle Jacques had a different design philosophy. And it's very simple, like inventing the wheel, but she helped invent it. And it is non-linearity in dungeons. Why have one entrance that an adventuring party can slip right inside when you can have many entrances that adventuring parties could slip right inside instead? Okay, I'm gonna need to work on my phrasing here. What I'm saying is why have one corridor and one room? Why not have multiple corridors, multiple rooms, multiple traps, multiple ways into the lower levels of the dungeon? For example, the Caverns of Thracia had three distinct entrances, and there were holes in the dungeon at various points where adventurers could get a rope and simply climb down to the level 2, to the floors below, right in the middle of that part of the dungeon. This was pretty unprecedented, and it massively improves gameplay, immersion, and replayability of the dungeon by making the module exponentially more complicated, less obvious to navigate, and therefore more interesting for players to experience, but also for dungeon masters to run over and over and over again. As Justin himself says in Jaquain the Dungeon, quote, "The players make it their own. They can retreat, circle around, rush ahead, go back over old ground, poke around, sneak through, interrogate the locals for secret routes. The possibilities are endless because the environment isn't forcing them along a pre-designed path, and throughout it all, the players are experiencing the thrill of truly exploring the dungeon complex." This is non-linear dungeon design. This is adding interconnectivity within dungeons, and this is now known as Jaquain a dungeon, especially within the OSR community where the term is lingua franca now. That is until very recently, when Justin Alexander's new best-selling book came out and readers discovered that the term he uses for this non-linear dungeon design has changed from Jaquain a dungeon, named after Janelle Jacques, to Xandering a dungeon, named after Justin Alexander himself. And now, today, if you go back to the original blog post from 2010, where Justin originally coined the phrase Jaquain a dungeon to describe this design, you'll see that the title there has also changed. The article is now called Xandering a dungeon. It seems that at some stage in the 2020s, Justin has gone back to his original post and changed the title and the term, and all references of Jaquain have been changed to Xandering instead. It's like looking at one of those old Stalin pictures. In fact, all the images that I've used in this video that reference the term Jaquain from the Alexandrian were actually taken using the Wayback Machine. That article that I quoted looks like this now. So this is where the accusations that Justin is trying to claim credit for Janelle's ideas and work has come in, and it's kind of exploded into the community through the article Xandering is Slandering, posted last week on the DIY and Dragons blog. In this article, the author Anne says that, quote, "On January 10th, 2024, the game designer Janelle Jacques died, and at a time when she should be remembered and celebrated, Justin Alexander is trying to erase her. This is a really serious accusation, and on the face of it, it looks really bad for Justin. However, this didn't go unnoted by Justin himself. In November of last year, just as his new book launched, Justin wrote an article called A Historical Note on Xandring, and in this article, he explained his rationale for changing the term from Jaquain, a dungeon, to Xandring, a dungeon. Now, I have to say, this article starts on a really bad note, because right at the beginning, he frames the issue as the following. In 2023, for better or for worse, the term Jaquain was changed to Xandring.
We're all trying to find the guy who did this.
Okay, so let's all just be clear here. Justin Alexander is the one who personally changed the term to Xandring. Full stop. I'm not sure why he wrote this article like the Hamburglar did it, but he does at the very least give 3 different reasons why the term was changed. The first 2 reasons that he gives are a little bit weird. He makes it sound like Janelle had asked him to change the term. And while this is true, it's leaving out quite a bit of nuance. See, when Justin first coined the phrase, he got Janelle's name wrong, and he left out an S in her surname. This has always really bothered Janelle. It would be like calling something Gygarian rather than Gygaxian. It's just wrong. It's the wrong name. So she asked Justin to change the name from Jaquain the dungeon to Jaquaizing the dungeon, something which Justin never did. And this annoyed her quite a bit, as the Xandring is Slandering article shows in many, many images. Yeah, so she clearly, I think she had an opinion on this, and I think she wanted it changed. I'm not sure why Justin brings this up, because all this explains is why the name of the term would be changed from Jaquaing the dungeon to Jaquaizing the dungeon, not why he would change it to Xandring, named after himself. I mean, even including this information in the article is kind of weird, and it intentionally or unintentionally gives the impression that Janelle was the agent behind the name change to Xandring, as if this was something that she wanted. But that doesn't seem to be the case. It's just a rhetorical sleight of hand that only really adds confusion to the story, because Janelle isn't here to clarify any different. In covering this explanation, the Xandring is Slandering article says this: I'm sure that Justin has been planning to introduce the term Xandring since before Janelle got sick. But because of Janelle's illness, Justin was now free to claim more or less anything that he wanted, and the public would have to take his word for it, because he was the only witness to these events able to speak up. I think this is ghoulish. I think it's grotesque. Well, personally for me, I think this interpretation of events goes way too far, because Justin does give a 3rd reason for the change from Jaquain to Xandring in this article, and I think it's the only explanation that should have been given in the article, honestly, because his 3rd reason is that the publisher of his new book asked him to change the name because they thought that using another creator's name in a neologism created a legal question. As Justin writes, not an arduous or terrible one, but one that resulted in the conclusion that there is some risk in using a word based on someone else's name. Let's not do that. And so based on this feedback from his publisher, Justin says that this is when he changed the term to Xandring. And that is, in my opinion, the real relevant explanation. Everything else is a little bit irrelevant. However, explanation or not, this has created a huge mess, one that is pulling the OSR community apart, especially now, because it needs to be acknowledged that Janelle Jaquays has passed away very, very recently, and that makes this discussion all the much more raw. I think that's why the article Xandring is Slandering is saying incredibly strong things like this. If you want to talk about non-linear dungeons in a way that honors a person instead of just the idea of non-linearity, you should call them Jaquazian. If you say Jaquain, you're acknowledging the right person, but spelling her name and the term wrong. There is no reason to ever say Xandring, unless you want it to mean something, like trying to take credit for someone else's ideas, while simultaneously Xing them out of history and slandering their memory. But you could probably simply call that plagiarism, appropriation, vainglory, or just dishonesty. That's pretty strong. But the question remains, has Justin Alexander actually plagiarized Janelle Jaquays? Has he erased her contribution contributions to role-playing games, and has he stolen her legacy in a dishonest manner? And in my opinion, no, I don't think so. For one, I think it's important that we remember that Justin does credit Janelle Jaquays like 5 different times in his Jaquaying the Dungeon article, even after he changed the name to Xandering the Dungeon. He writes clearly that the article is inspired by the work of Janelle, and he acknowledges her contributions in his post, alongside a number of other creators as well. I don't think it's fair to say that he has plagiarized anyone, nor is he trying to stamp out their legacy, and I don't see why he would want to anyway, to be honest. In Xandering is Slandering, Anne argues that Justin is doing this because his book is opening up his work to a brand new audience, and that Justin wants to claim the credit and praise from those who don't know the historical context of Janelle's work, and that Justin hopes that they'll only think of him when reading his book and his blog, and by implication then, not the work of formative creators like Janelle Jaquays. But I don't think this is fair, and I don't think that the characterization of Justin as a vainglorious narcissist is fair either. For one, Justin Alexander has a lot to be proud of already without stealing anything. He has contributed to a lot of seminal work in RPGs, and his Alexandrian blog is extremely influential already, to put it mildly. His work developing the 3 clue rules, his article on node-based design, these ideas, they stand on their own. In short, he has created some really swell stuff. I don't think that he would need to steal from anyone in order to garner credit and praise. What seems more likely to me is that he simply was genuinely worried that naming a term after another person in his book would carry some level of legal risk, however remote. And so, rather than honor Janelle, he changed the name of the term he coined in order to mitigate the risk, as his publisher asked him to do so. Of course, he must have known that in effect, this would work to minimize Janelle's contribution. And I think that the renaming of Jaquazing to Xandering is in bad taste, especially considering the tragic circumstances of Janelle's passing. And while I personally think that his publisher was wrong to fear any level of legal risk, I don't see where that would have come in. But if we take their fear at face value, I still think that the correct decision would have been to instead use a more generic term, like twirly whirling the dungeon instead. Yeah, that would have been sick. And if that didn't cut it, then maybe the section just shouldn't have been included in the new book at all, because then we could have avoided changing what would have been a term honoring the work of Janelle, someone from a marginalized community, to something that doesn't, and does in practice sort of overshadow the work that she's done. And maybe this scandal would have been prevented. I mean, it's not like there's not already a ton of great content in the Alexandrian that could have instead been included in this So You Want to Be a Game Master book instead. And for that reason, I'd like to see the original article in the Alexandrian be renamed to Jaquazing the Dungeon, both to satisfy Janelle's public wishes, but also to honor her contribution to our hobby. I think that that would be the most fitting result of all of this. That said, however, I don't think that Justin should be villainized for changing the term to Xandering. To me, it reads more like a mistake rather than a malicious decision. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to stay up to date with all the RPG news and views, then subscribe to the channel. Now I click here for something a little bit funner. Spoiler, it's the biggest trash fire in Dungeons and Dragons history. And by the way, this content takes a long time to research and write, so if you appreciate it, then please check out my Patreon at patreon.com/discourseminis, where you'll get access to bonus videos, an entire horror game, and chill patron-only live streams and secret Discord rooms, where I personally hang out and chat with patrons. I'd really appreciate it, and I can't do this without your support. And a massive thanks to my patrons, especially CryptoKev and Travis Hunter. And I'll see y'all next time. Bye-bye.